with Crisis Core coming out pretty much just about the time of the recording of this video. Crisis Core Reunion, the remake that is, the next installment of Final Fantasy VII, the remake, coming in 2023, Final Fantasy 16 on the horizon, and me being a giant Final Fantasy fan, I decided I wanted to rank what I think are the five most influential or impactful titles in the series. And to be really clear, this doesn't mean they're the best. In some cases, it's actually quite the opposite. But it's about impact and influence on culture in general, but also on the franchise. So, with that said, um, let's go ahead and get started. So, first on the list, and if you did see my list of the basically ranking all Final Fantasy numbered games, this is the worst game they've ever made, but that's actually why I think it is number five on this list. And it's as simple as up until Final Fantasy 15, they'd never really made a bad game. You could argue 12, like even with the Zodiac Age update, but 12 was a flawed game. There were a lot of mistakes in it, but the story was actually really strong, and a lot of people still enjoyed 12. It didn't have the cult following or the replayability that a lot of the Final Fantasy titles have, but I don't think it was a bad game. 15 sucked. Yes, they've patched and they've fixed a bunch of things eventually, but even after all that, it's not very good. It's just a boy band simulator. The story's kind of meh. The characters are meh. The AI is terrible. The battle system has some really interesting components, but a lot of bleh components. And it was technically their second foray into a truly an action RPG rather than some form of turn based or ATB based system. Technically, Crisis Core is their first foray into an action game, and Crisis Core was great. The new updated version, Crisis Core Reunion, will be very very good as well. I have it. I've played it for a couple hours. It's great. But 15 wasn't, and to me that's what makes it such an impactful, important game, because they really are to a degree at a turning point in the franchise. It's one of the biggest franchises in the game industry. Final Fantasy 14 is you know one of the biggest names, places, etc. in the gaming space. But their last major installment stunk. Like, yeah, 7 Remake was good, and people liked Intergrade, and Crisis Core Reunion looks like it's not only going to be really good, but well received. But the last major, like, new title you put out stunk, and everybody hated it. They've got to nail 16. And I think the reason I believe that 15 qualifies as being the fifth most impactful or influential game in the franchise's history is because the next installment after 15 is the first M-rated game they've ever made. They took a lot of feedback from players, and they took, frankly, a hit in the pocketbook and to their reputation, and they're taking it seriously, and they're making a more mature game. They have an average audience that's a little bit older now. More mature games are popular, and I think they're learning a lot of lessons from 15. So for me, that is the fifth most impactful. The fourth is Final Fantasy X. Again, not about best or worst games. I had this ranked very highly on my video ranking all of the Final Fantasy games. But to me, this is the fourth most impactful game because it was a major turning point in the franchise. Final Fantasy X is the last true turn-based Final Fantasy title Square has made. They made Bravely Default, Octopath. Like, they've made other games that still use turn-based mechanics. 10 is the last traditional, Final Fantasy game they made. My brother and I agree, and a lot of other people I've talked to agree as well. A big part of that is because 10 is perfect. Like, you might not like some of the characters, you might not like the story, but like if you're just talking mechanically, like gameplay wise, you can't build a better turn-based RPG than Final Fantasy X. It's a perfect game. And they wanted to continue to innovate and do new things and push boundaries, and so they just started to decide to go in newer directions, and that's been hit or miss. 12 definitely failed. Zodiac Age kind of fixed it, but still, eh. 13 was very kinetic and fun, and 13.2 was really kinetic and fun. We don't talk about 13.3. Again, controversial though. 14's obviously an MMO. 15 had some cool ideas, but at the end of the day sucked. So, like, 10 was a major turning point for the franchise. They did so well, they made it damn near, or depending on how you look at it, really accomplish making a perfect game. And they've really had to pivot, and it's been more hit or miss after Final Fantasy X than it ever was before Final Fantasy X. Um, and so for me, that is a huge impact when you make something so good that it forces you to pivot creatively. Um, Another game, not just because it's sequentially after 10, but just because, um, Final Fantasy 11 had a huge impact on the Final Fantasy franchise. Way back when 11 came out, MMOs was like, as far as like mainstream MMOs, like there was EverQuest and I think RuneScape, but like it was WoW. It was WoW and it was everybody else. And 11 was one of the first that came out there and they didn't take it over like 14 has, but it bit into a chunk of WoW's player base. For all of its flaws and all of its issues and all of its poor balancing for solo players and lack of certain elements of matchmaking and some of the early issues that 11 had, a lot of people, myself included, loved that game. And 11 doing so well and lasting so long led to 14. And 14 has completely taken over the MMO space in the gaming industry and has become the gold standard and stands on its own as one of the absolute best games out there in any way, shape, or form. That doesn't happen if 11 doesn't work. So it opened up a whole nother avenue for Square to go down development wise. Next on the list, uh, it's the game that started it all. Which, of course, you're going to be thinking, well, what game could possibly be more impactful on the Final Fantasy franchise than literally the game that started the Final Fantasy franchise and literally saved Square as a studio? Square Enix would not have existed if this game didn't do as well as it did. This was their final fantasy. Like, we're dead in the water. And the game did well and blew up and started a franchise that eventually had major cultural implications, like not just in Japan, but in the West too. You know, you play One Winged Angel, you play the Hymn of the Faith, you play some of the music from these different games, you show people Vivi, you like these are things that people, even people who've never played these games, recognize. None of that happens if they didn't take one last gamble, roll those dice, and roll a nat 20. And that's what they did with Final Fantasy 1. The number one on this list, and it's the only one that could be number one on this list, is Final Fantasy 7. You want to know if I think it's the best Final Fantasy game ever? Again, go watch my other video. But is it the most influential and the most impactful? It's without question. Final Fantasy VII took Final Fantasy from being a niche product into a global phenomena. 7 sold more copies than any RPG had before. It basically brought the JRPG genre to the West, to America, to Europe, etc. And it is such a iconic, beloved franchise that 20 plus years later, one of the best games of the year was literally just a remake of that game. Um, there's spin-off games from it, Crisis Core, which again has just had its own remake. Crisis Core, criminally underrated game, by the way. Dirge of Cerberus wasn't a great game, but told a really good story. The Advent Children movie, the animated movie, still holds up. Really, it does. It still holds up. And I watched that when I was in high school. I watched that during class when I was in high school. Was not very studious. It's iconic, just completely above and beyond really any other game in the series, but more than that, impactful. What it did for the franchise, what it did for the brand, what it did for culture, what it did for its reach. If we're looking at impact and influence, Final Fantasy VII stands alone. So for some people it's their favorite, for some people they think it's the best, but for me I think empirically and unequivocally it is without a doubt the most influential game in the series. And I don't think it's entirely a coincidence that after their biggest failure, number 5 on this list, they went back to the well of their greatest success and got people loving the franchise again by capitalizing on that greatest success and telling old stories, but also telling new stories. So that's my list. Go into the comments section, tell me yours, tell me what you agree with, what you disagree with. If you enjoy the content, comment, and subscribe. The channel has a variety of on different videos, really just whatever I feel about riffing on. Sometimes it'll be sports, especially Saints related stuff because I'm a Saints fan. It'll be anime, it'll be video games, it'll be whatever I feel about talking about. And I always enjoy it when people hop in the comments. Even if you just want to be an asshat, have at it. Let's have some fun.